Hi everyone. I hope that you are having a good week so far. We are now in our discussion class 2. So to provide an overview of what I'll be going over today, I'm going to review important terms, and these terms are included in your handout. I will be going over an activity, one for operant conditioning and another activity for respondent conditioning. If you want an example of how the handout should be completed, please refer back to the discussion section 1 video where I show how you can fill out the handout. So first, terms that we're going to review is the 7 core principles of ABA. The acronym is ABA-TCEG. So for applied, the A, it talks about how behaviors, when we're changing behaviors, they must be socially significant and improve day-to-day life. So for example, maybe we're trying to support a student's social skills, or maybe we're trying to help them be more independent, like teaching them some self-care activities or some independent living skills. Behavioral indicates that the behavior must be observable and measurable. As we discussed last week, behavior cannot be something that is, for example, a feeling, because we aren't able to actually observe a student's feeling, but what we can observe is a behavior. Next is analytic. So as discussed previously, ABA is based on database decision making. Therefore, database decisions must be made throughout the intervention or procedure that you're implementing to treat the student's behavior. Technological indicates that all procedures are described well enough to be replicated. This is especially important in schools. Whatever intervention that you're implementing with a student, other staff should be able to implement easily as well. That way, everyone can be on the same page and support the student in having the behavior be replicated across different settings. The C stands for conceptually systematic. So procedures for changing the behavior should be based on relevant principles in ABA and also based on literature, especially evidence-based interventions and research. Effective, so whatever intervention or procedure you're implementing should actually improve the behavior that you're seeking to change in the student. So throughout your intervention, you need to ensure that you are measuring the student's progress to ensure that the behavior is actually being improved over time. Generality, so the skill or behavior must be demonstrated across multiple settings. So for example, if we want to work on Tommy's hand-raising skills in science, we should also be able to see that he is improving in hand-raising instead of shouting out in his other classes. The next term I'll review is response class. So the definition of a response class is a group of responses of varying topography. Topography is what the behavior looks like, all of which produce the same effect on the environment. This means that the responses may physically look different even though they have the same effect on the environment. So here's an example of a response class, gaining attention. So that can look like raising your hand, tapping on a shoulder, saying someone's name. All of those are different behaviors, but they serve the same purpose of gaining someone's attention. A non-example would be someone screaming for attention and running away to escape. Since these serve different purposes, they would not be a response class because they do not have the same effect on the environment. Next, we are going to review operant conditioning. So operant conditioning describes what happens after the behavior influences its future frequency. And so as Dr. Johnson will review, there's positive and negative, and there's also reinforcement and punishment. So the easy way to remember this is with positive, we're always adding something, and with negative, we're always taking something away. With reinforcement, we're always trying to increase the person's behavior, and with punishment, we're always trying to decrease the person's behavior. So positive reinforcement, so add something, behavior increases. So for example, when Malcolm raises his hand quietly, he receives an M&M, which means that he will increase his behavior. Negative reinforcement, take away something, behavior increases. Positive punishment, add something, behavior decreases. Negative punishment, take away something, behavior decreases. So let's look at some examples of all of these. So first, let's look at the difference between positive versus negative reinforcement. So remember, reinforcement means behavior increases, positive means we add something, and negative means we take something away. So an example of positive reinforcement is a student studied for a test. They got an A+ on that test. So that will increase their behavior of studying because they will likely study for the next test so that they can actually get another good grade. An example of negative reinforcement is that an individual took out the trash. As a consequence, the foul smell in the house went away, and that means they will continue to take out the trash because the reinforcement is that the smell is going away in the house. Now let's go over punishment. Remember that punishment means decreasing the behavior. Positive means we add something, and negative means we take something away. Let's say that a teacher wants to reduce Bart's inappropriate interactions in class. The first example is positive punishment. The teacher adds something Bart doesn't like, such as writing on the board over and over again. The other example is negative reinforcement. Bart gets his skateboard taken away. Both of these are ways that decrease Bart's behavior of having inappropriate interactions in class. So for your first activity, you're going to practice creating 2 3-term contingencies based on the concepts of operant conditioning. So first, you'll create 2 ABC contingencies for the behavior. Next, you'll determine whether it is positive or negative reinforcement or punishment, and you'll write the contingency on your handout. So to provide you an example of how this would look, so for my first example, I have, for my antecedent, Lucy's mom asks her to clean her room. For the behavior, Lucy cleans up her toys. Consequence, her mom gives her a bag of M&Ms. So as we can see, this would be an example of positive reinforcement because Lucy is given M&Ms as a reward for cleaning up her room, which will increase her future behavior of cleaning up her room when her mom asks her to. So for the next example, I have Mary's teacher gives her a worksheet. The behavior then is Mary screams and throws the worksheet on the ground. As a consequence, Mary's teacher takes away the worksheet. This would be an example of negative reinforcement because Mary is now learning that when she screams and throws the worksheet on the ground, she no longer has to do it because her teacher will take it away. So on your handout, I want you to do something similar where you describe 2 different examples and then explain what type of stimulus change is occurring and what effect on the future behavior is happening. This will also be good practice for your quiz because there's a couple questions that ask about whether or not certain actions would be considered positive or negative reinforcement or punishment. Next, let's go over respondent conditioning, also known as classical conditioning. So the important terms here are first unconditioned stimulus, which it means that the object or thing elicits a response naturally. Unconditioned response, result of the presentation of an unconditioned stimulus. Neutral stimulus, stimulus that does not elicit a natural physiological response. Conditioned stimulus, previously neutral stimulus that comes to elicit a response after repeated pairings with an unconditioned stimulus. Conditioned response, the result of the presentation of a conditioned stimulus. So these are a lot of terminologies. So let's go over an example to clarify what all this means. So let's think about Pavlov and his dogs. So before conditioning, we would have a dog who would salivate at food. So in this case, food would be the unconditioned stimulus. And then the unconditioned response is that the dog would salivate at food because they would start to get hungry. So then before conditioning, Pavlov used a neutral stimulus, which was a whistle, And when he first blew the whistle, there would be no saliva because it was a no conditioned response. A dog isn't naturally going to have salivate when they hear a whistle noise. However, with conditioning, Pavlov would then pair the whistle sound every time he gave food, and this would result in the dog salivating with an unconditioned response. And then after conditioning, Pavlov could then just use the whistle, so that is now the conditioned stimulus, and then the conditioned response is that the dog would salivate because they are used to having the whistle paired with the food. So without the food, the dog would still salivate even with the whistle. So for your next activity, you're going to practice identifying unconditioned stimuli and conditioned stimuli and neutral stimulus using the experiment of little Albert. So in a moment, we will watch this video. So little Albert was an unethical study. Now, definitely would not get IRB approval nowadays. But essentially, Watson conditioned a baby named Albert to have a fear of rats and other similar white, fluffy types of animals. So we're going to watch a video to see how he conditioned Albert to gain this phobia.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats. Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
So obviously this is a pretty sad and unethical experiment, but it is a good example of how respondent conditioning looks. And so what you're going to be doing for your next activity is you're going to think about what parts of the experiment match with these different terms. So before conditioning, what was the unconditioned stimulus and what was Albert's unconditioned response? What would be the neutral stimulus and what would be the neutral response?
And then you're going to also look at during conditioning. So the neutral response 1, the unconditioned stimulus, and then the unconditioned response. And then after conditioning, conditioned stimulus, and then conditioned response. So if you have trouble thinking about how to fill this out, I recommend going back to this part of the video where I showed this example about Pavlov's dog. And then you can think about, in the case of little Albert, how would each of the steps of Watson's experiment fit in with these different terms? All right, so that's it. Thank you for listening in. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or come to my office hours on Wednesdays.